Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The morning arrived cloaked in a heavy curtain of rain, the kind that fell in relentless sheets, turning the earth into a sea of mud. Tieu Nuong stood in the middle of a muddy field, her hands trembling as she gripped the sickle, its blade dull from hours of cutting grass. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of wet soil and the faint tang of cow dung, a bitter reminder of the life she'd been forced into. Her faded green shirt clung to her skin, soaked through by the rain, its edges frayed from years of wear. The familiar sounds of the countryside were muffled by the downpour, the distant crowing of roosters, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the soft murmur of the river that ran like a silver thread through the village. She glanced at the cows in the nearby shed, their low moans a quiet plea for the grass she was cutting, but her heart was elsewhere, lost in the ache of her solitude. Tieu Nuong bent down, her hands deftly slicing through the tall grass, each cut a small act of endurance in a world that had stripped her of her freedom. She had been here for days, forced into servitude at the house of a harsh mistress, a woman who had taken her in to repay her uncle's debt of 50 million dong. The promise of 2 years of labor loomed over her like a dark cloud, each day a quiet battle against the ache in her heart. She was an orphaned girl, her parents a fading memory in the haze of her solitude, her only family the uncle who had betrayed her, luring her back with false apologies and promises of chickens, only to sell her into this life of toil. Now she was alone, her only companions the cows, the rain, and the man who lingered in her thoughts, Mr. Chung. Mr. Chung was a steady presence, a man whose quiet kindness had lit up her days like a lantern in the dark. He was a carpenter from the next village, with hands roughened by wood and a smile that felt like a rare gift in her lonely world. They had met at the market one rainy afternoon, when he'd helped her carry her vegetables, his laughter a melody that had warmed her heart. Since then he had become a constant in her life, never demanding, always there with a kind word or a shared moment. He spoke of dreams, of building a better life, of crafting things that lasted. "I'll make you a proper roof one day," he'd said once, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "One that doesn't leak when it rains." Tieu Nuong had smiled, but inside, her heart had trembled. She wanted to believe in his words, in the future he painted with his quiet promises, but now those promises felt distant, a faint light in the darkness of her new reality. She stood, her hands stained with dirt, her eyes fixed on the river in the distance. The rain fell steadily, a cold curtain that blurred the world around her, and she felt the weight of her solitude like a stone in her chest. "I wonder if he'll come looking for me," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the downpour, her heart a tangle of longing and fear. She thought of her parents, of the mother whose voice had once been her lullaby, of the father whose hands had once lifted her onto his shoulders, their faces now a fading memory in the haze of her solitude. She thought of her tent, the fragile shelter she built for herself, now abandoned, its thatched roof a stark reminder of the life she'd lost. The mistress's voice broke her thoughts, its sharp edge cutting through the rain like a knife. "Hurry up, girl," the woman shouted, her hands on her hips, her eyes cold with impatience. "You're too slow. My cows can't starve while you daydream." Tieu Nuong nodded, her heart sinking like a stone in her chest, her hands trembling as she resumed her work. The grass was tough, its blades sharp against her skin, and her hands ached from the effort, her fingers raw from the cold. "Cut them long," the mistress barked, her voice firm, her eyes sharp with judgment. "How can they eat if you cut them so short? Do it properly, or you'll go hungry tonight." Tieu Nuong felt her breath catch, her hands trembling as she adjusted her cuts, her heart a tangle of fear and exhaustion. She thought of the meals she'd been denied, the small portions of rice that were her only sustenance, the bitter taste of hunger a constant companion in this house. "I'm trying," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've never done this before. Why is my fate so miserable?" She thought of the mistress's promise, the words that had once given her hope. "I'll treat you like my own child." But those words had been a lie replaced by curses and threats, each one a quiet wound in her heart. The rain fell harder, its cold fingers seeping through her shirt, chilling her skin, but she pressed on, her steps steady despite the mud that clung to her feet. She thought of Mr. Chung, of the way his laughter had filled the silences in her life, of the warmth in his touch, the steadiness in his presence. Please save me, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes fixed on the river in the distance. She thought of her tent, of the basket she'd left behind, of the life she'd built for herself before her uncle's betrayal. Will he find me? She wondered, her heart a tangle of longing and fear, her hands trembling as she tied the grass into bundles, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar task. Meanwhile, in a small village on the other side of the river, Mr. Chung stood in the middle of a muddy road, his hands stained with dirt, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The rain fell steadily, a cold curtain that blurred the world around him, but his heart was elsewhere, lost in the ache of his worry. He had been delivering goods all morning, his truck loaded with sand and wood, its wheels sinking into the mud with each turn. The road is dangerous today, he murmured to himself, his voice low, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a quiet resolve. But I have to finish this, I need to find Nuong. He had been to her tent that morning, his heart heavy with a quiet longing, his hands trembling as he called her name. Nuong, he'd shouted, his voice echoing through the empty field, but there had been no answer, only the basket she'd left behind, its woven strands a stark reminder of her absence. He had searched the tent, his eyes scanning the small space for any sign of her, but there had been nothing, no note, no trace, only the faint scent of damp earth and the memory of her smile. Where have you gone? He whispered to himself, his voice trembling with emotion, his heart a tangle of worry and fear. He had called his mother, his voice low with a quiet urgency, his hands trembling as he held the phone to his ear. Mom, he'd said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. Have you been to Linda's place today? I went to Nuong's tent but she's not there. I'm worried. His mother's voice had been soft, tinged with a quiet concern, but she had no answers, her words a faint comfort against the storm of his worry. I'm sorry, Chung, she'd said, her voice low. I haven't been to Linda's today, try calling your brother. Mr. Chung had nodded, his heart sinking like a stone in his chest, his hands trembling as he dialed his brother's number. Kwong, he'd said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Are you at Linda's place? I'm looking for Nuong. She's not at her tent and I'm worried. His brother's voice had been steady, tinged with a quiet concern, but he had no answers, his words a faint comfort against the storm of his worry. I'm at Linda's, Kwong had said, his voice low. But I haven't seen her, sorry, Chung. Mr. Chung had thanked him, his heart a tangle of worry and fear, his eyes fixed on the river in the distance. Where could she be? He whispered to himself, his voice trembling with emotion, his hands clenching into fists. He thought of the days they'd spent together, of the quiet moments by the river, of the dreams he'd shared with her, dreams of a life where they could be together, where the rain wouldn't seep through the roof, where she wouldn't have to carry the weight of her past alone. I hope nothing's happened to her, he murmured to himself, his voice low, his heart heavy with a quiet dread. Back at the mistress's house, Tieu Nuong worked in silence, her hands trembling as she tied the grass into bundles, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar task. The mistress stood nearby, her eyes sharp with impatience, her voice firm with a quiet judgment. You can't even tie a rope properly, she barked, her hands on her hips, her eyes cold with disdain. This is the first time I'll show you, next time you do it yourself. Hurry up, girl. My cows need to eat twice a day. Tieu Nuong nodded, her heart sinking like a stone in her chest, her hands trembling as she worked, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She thought of the meals she'd been denied, the small portions of rice that were her only sustenance, the bitter taste of hunger a constant companion in this house. If you want to rest, you'll go hungry tonight, the mistress had said, her voice firm, her eyes cold with judgment. Work properly and I'll give you a bowl of rice. Otherwise you'll starve. Tieu Nuong had nodded, her heart a tangle of fear and exhaustion, her eyes fixed on the ground as she worked, the weight of her new reality pressing down on her like a stone. The rain fell harder, its cold fingers seeping through her shirt, chilling her skin, but she pressed on, her steps steady despite the mud that clung to her feet. She thought of Mr. Chung, of the way he'd smiled at her, of the warmth in his touch, the steadiness in his presence. Please find me, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes fixed on the river in the distance. She thought of her parents, of the mother whose voice had once been her lullaby, of the father whose hands had once lifted her onto his shoulders, their faces now a fading memory in the haze of her solitude. As the day drew to a close, Tieu Nuong sat on the edge of the field, her hands stained with dirt, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The rain fell steadily, a cold curtain that blurred the world around her, but her heart was elsewhere, lost in the ache of her longing. She thought of her tent, of the life she'd built for herself, of the man who had brought light to her days. Will he find me? She wondered, her heart a tangle of longing and fear, her hands trembling as she clutched the sickle, its blade a stark reminder of her new reality. Meanwhile, Mr. Chung stood by the river, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart heavy with a quiet dread. The rain fell steadily, a cold drumbeat on the earth below, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in the ache of his worry. "I'll wait here a little longer," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling with emotion, his hands clenching into fists. "I have to find her. I can't lose her." He thought of the days they'd spent together, of the quiet moments by the river, of the dreams he'd shared with her, dreams of a life where they could be together, where the rain wouldn't seep through the roof, where she wouldn't have to carry the weight of her past alone. Would Mr. Chung find her as he hoped, and pull her from the shadows of her new reality? Would Tieu Nuong find the strength to endure, to hold on to the fragile hope she'd carried through the years? Or would she be lost to the currents of her uncle's betrayal? The rain offered no answers, only its steady, mournful song, and the moonlight, hidden behind the clouds, remained silent, a witness to their quiet longing. For now, Tieu Nuong had the field, the rain, and the memory of a man who had brought light to her days, a small constellation of hope in the vast stormy sky of her life.